Good afternoon. My name is Mirjana Roksandic. I'm a professor at the University of Winnipeg. And today I will be talking about my understanding of mortuary archaeology and how we can actually approach the study of burial evidence or burial record. So death and burial fall into this category of rites of passage, right? And these are the ones that leave direct traces that we can actually ascertain archaeologically with a relative ease, like some other rites of passage, like marriage, can potentially leave evidence of feasting and stuff like that. But it requires a more thorough interpretation to get to the conclusion that this is indeed evidence of a rite of passage. With burials, because of the existence of the body and the existence of burial context, this is a relatively easy task, and this has actually been used. So this has been archaeologically evidenced for a very long time. So access, these burial rituals allow us access to some cognitive ritual and ideological processes associated with a particular culture. What I'm talking about today concerns the burial practices as seen through the body and disposal of the body in the context of burial practices. And the most important proponent or developer of this Anthropology du terrain or archaeothanatology was Dudet. His book, published in 2006, summarizes all of the steps needed in order to properly examine archaeothanatological evidence aloud. In 2002, I published a paper called Dispositional Taphonomy, and it was based essentially on Dudet's work, which was not particularly well recognized in English-speaking literature. And I just wanted to draw attention to it and apply it to some of the specimens, some of the burials that I have from Iron Gates Gorge. So one of the key things in archaeothanatology is that it centers on the skeleton and examines minute details of skeletal disposition. So how the bones are related to each other, whether they're in their primary position, whether they have been moved, when have they been moved? And, so from these very small, very minute details of position of individual bones, Dudet and his colleagues or his school are able to determine potential evidence of the original burial position and potentially the evidence of subsequent manipulation of the skeleton. And what is really important about archaeothanatology is that it's actually that if you do not apply this methodology consistently throughout your burial excavations, you're likely not to even know that you are missing potentially relevant information, because the details that often the detailed analysis will show you that there is something that is not 100% as it looks when you do not take the small details of the position of burials into account. And if you don't record it, you are actually missing it. So this is the basic premise of my work in interpretation of burial ritual, is that you are collecting all the relevant information directly in the field. And how this, however, dispositional taphonomy is not an answer in itself. Once you go from this detailed recording and detailed understanding of each of these burial positions, how do you interpret that? So that's the part where my talk is concentrated, assuming that you are either familiar or will get familiar with archaeothanatology. So once we actually recorded all this information, I want to look into what is the interpretative potential of this positional information and how we can actually tap into that resource, because once it's just a description, well, it's fine and dandy, but what does that detailed and thorough description of a burial process tell us about the society? Dispositional taphonomy or archaeothanatology allows us to reach into the gestures that are performed within the burial and into ancestral rituals, but there is no direct correlation or equation between these gestures and their meaning. So we can't really take these descriptions of burial acts, if you want, that we derived from archaeothanatology and immediately have a picture of the society. So there is a lot of unknown, like do we, lots of times you're going to have very impressionistic, once this detailed explanation is given, the author goes on to give his own or her own interpretation in impressionistic, or maybe their own, how would I put that, emotional state when they actually discover that. But this doesn't really give me any insight into what the people, the archaeological groups that we were looking at were thinking. It just gives me insight into what the author of the paper is thinking, which is, for the most part, not particularly interesting. So, so this is why we need a better conceptualization. We need to look into the universals in the burial practice. We need to look into what it is that this dead body represents. So what is this essential quality? And then also we need to a very detailed contextualization to let us put this essential quality of the dead body and the universals in burial practices to work towards the interpretation of a particular archaeological group that we're studying. So mortuary archaeology, I mean, there has been tons of material written about it. It's a very, very intensive field of study because these burials are very, very direct remains of ritual activity that lead us to understanding maybe cognitive or ideological processes in a group. But most of them were actually based on burial goods and architecture. In terms of cultural history, it was normative approach. This group does this in this way, buried with this type of artifacts and blah, blah, blah. In processual, the emphasis became on the social persona. So how much effort does a society need to put into building particular burial grounds? How much effort does it need to put all the wealth associated with the burial? So again, the focus was on goods and architecture. Post-processual archaeology is mostly concerned with remembrance and agency. What does this potentially mean? So I think that sometimes these theoretical positions can limit our understanding or our ability to actually go deeper into understanding of a group. So with the processual approach, main problem is that it's both particularistic and that once it's built, it represents the stiff mold. And, like we've seen since like that, you can have a dog buried with very, how would I put it, very important number of grave goods. So does that mean that that dog had a very high standing in the society? Well, not really necessarily. It might be, but there is lots of reasons why particular actions can be performed within a society. So this stiff mold of equating the number of goods with the social position of the buried individual really doesn't always work. And the post-processual approach really was very, very important in critiquing the formal analogy, the evolutionism and positivism inherent in both the culture history and processual approach. But it came up with extreme relativism, right? And some ideological dogmatism. There's lots of a prioris in that. So basically what it's saying is that my understanding of the world is, as an archaeologist, I am actually understanding the world through the lens of my of the culture in which I am encultured, and that this is going to basically, that my ideological position is going to influence how I interpret these burials. Well, if that's the case, then if I'm, just in this case of reporting detailed analysis of a burial and then ending it up with an emotional statement about what it made you feel when you were looking at that. Sure, if that is the case, if I am actually only repeating my ideological position based, then all of my interpretations of burials are always going to be the same. And I'm not revealing anything, or I'm not understanding anything about the culture that I'm studying. I'm actually examining myself. And that's, to be quite frank, not particularly interesting from the archaeological point of view. I really would like to know something more about other people rather than just myself and my ideological position. So if that's the case, then why bother practicing archaeology? Because if all of my interpretations are limited by my understanding of the world, then I am not actually doing any service to archaeology as a discipline by practicing archaeology. But to be now to look back into whether this have actually been the end of archaeological practice, no, we're still practicing archaeology. And what we're doing now is collecting vast amounts of ever more sophisticated and precise information. But we also, I think where the critique was really good was that we are aware of our limitations, and we are aware of many of the conceptual problems that we come with because of our the way we're encultured. So one of the important things is to look into interpreting especially when, for example, you look into Mesolithic of Europe, you're looking in a society where your framework of reference is missing. You really do not know what these people did and how they behaved, and especially not know what they thought. And so when we talk about prehistoric societies, I'm actually including only those societies where we have neither a written record or oral histories to help us understand what is their potential, what was their potential social structure, what is their potential intellectual approach, ideology, cognitive phenomena, anything else that we could possibly come up with understanding the societies. And then, of course, the politics of who owns the past, where does archaeology fit, et cetera, will inherently bias our interpretation. But given that we are still practicing archaeology, we have to understand that we need to transcend these limitations and allow us to use what we've learned about societies to which we don't belong, societies that are outside of our immediate experience, through cross-cultural comparison, to be able to come up with inferences that are not as bounded as they are when we're just using our own society as a frame reference. So this assumes that there is a dialectical relationship between an individual we're studying and their surrounding, right? So we are going to assume that they're neither determined by their environmental conditions, neither they are the sole master of their own destiny and independent of the society around them. So what they're doing is that the individual is interwoven into the social and natural worlds in which it exists. So if we are trying to approximate these dialectical relationships, we're looking to study the skeleton as an individual, but also in the context, okay? So then we have to acknowledge that there is a dialectical relationship between the meaning and the construction of knowledge. So the meaning is given through culture, and the construction of knowledge is a process that is constantly in affect, right? So it's not like, a gesture will mean a certain thing in every single society. No, a gesture will mean lots of different things depending on the societal context, historical context, natural context, all sorts of things. So we can't really use whatever gesture we're able to discern to understand the whole body of the culture we're examining. And so we have to look into how to derive meaning. And one of the first things is that we derive the meaning in reference to something we know. So the fact that we derive the meaning is a reference to the culture that we're familiar with, means that we need to transcend those. But to go back to what does it actually mean to derive meaning through culture, is that culture, for those who are part of it, makes sense, right? It's the way that we position ourselves in natural and social world and negotiate critical questions. So this is what is the universal of human culture. And as you know, humans are incapable of surviving without being encultured, of being culturally bound. So in this context, cross-cultural comparison does not become this direct ethnographic analogy. It assumes that there is no lack of causative relationship between a mode of burial and any aspect of the society that we're interested in, right? But what cross-cultural comparison gives you is a scope of possible human responses to a particular question. So it gives you a lot of possibilities. It teaches you to go outside of your own culture to look into what other people could have thought, what people, how people interpret, and many different interpretations offered for any particular gesture or any particular type of behavior in a group. So what we do with archaeology, and where archaeology fits in, is it provides us the time, depth, and opportunity to observe these changes over time. It also allows us to look into potentially discovering modes of behavior that we haven't encountered among modern human or modern living human groups. So if I am a culturally bound person that examines another culture, which is what archaeologists do, what are my options? So first of all, I can try to transcend limitations by looking into cross-cultural comparison. So I can learn about other cultures and try to understand that there are many possible responses to a particular problem or phenomenon. And I also apply thick archaeology. So Karen Case have proposed in their 2004 book on Gathering Hopewell, in the introduction, they have proposed that to understand any gesture, you have to understand the context and as many different aspects of the culture that you can get at through the archaeological framework. One of the other things is that you have to acknowledge that in any dynamic system, there are too many variables to allow you to make predictions and causal relationships that can be established a priori. So Verndel made a very good comment that predicting any event, all sufficient past events, are approximately probabilistically irrelevant. So it doesn't, what it means is that one gesture does not necessarily follow by the other gesture. So what we are doing, we're a posteriori approximating the causes. So really, to interpret the past, you really have to have an open mind and get as much information as you can. However, there is a thin archaeology approach, which is basically descriptive, not trying to understand or formalize what is happening in a particular group through what you can discern from that about that group from archaeological record. So to go back to burials, one of the things we need to recognize is that changing state of being is always accompanied by a ritual. So if from birth is accompanied by a ritual because you're going from a non-being to an actual being, then the marriage, which is a transition or adulthood or any kind of rite of passage associated with your changing social persona, is associated with transitioning from one form of being to another. And that is the form of passage from a being to a non-living being. And so this non-living being is an ancestor, right? So you're no longer this individualized person, you become an ancestor in the group with all sorts of different connotations that it has. So seizing the perceptible form of being is how we could actually define a death, right? So burials also show evidence of the fact that people are dealing with death and dying. So you are disrupting a social network, social bonds in a group. You're disrupting your relationship with a person, etc., etc. So all of this needs to be dealt with, right? So the burial moves a person from an impermanent to this permanent state. It leaves permanent traces, and that is where it is very important for archaeologists, because we can actually see those traces. So as a transition, burial is really important because it shows us the preoccupation of humans with the purpose of life, so with the religion and ideology. So if a person dies, the agency within the burial is no longer with that person. It provides the society, the other people in the society are going to take over the agency. So you know, once you die, you really don't have, unless you have left a very particular will, which allows them to actually which makes sure that your wishes are followed. The agency remains with those who are actually performing the burial ritual. So this shift of agency will actually provide interesting variation in burial record, because now no longer it's your status, and this is where, you know, this comes in the critique, post-processual critique was important. Your status as an individual in the society is now less important than the status of those who actually have agency over your burial. So you're moving from being a living individual ephemeral body to a dead, corporate, and idealized, so basically essential body. And so the skeleton has this quality, which is fantastic, that it actually has witnesses both. It witnesses what we ate, how we behaved, what we did, how much suffering through diseases, etc. we have in this individual osteobiographic record, but it also talks about the the idealized and essential, how we are supposed to be perceived once we become ancestors. So how do we study burial? Well, first of all, we should concentrate on skeletal remains, because regardless of the burial enclosure or burial goods, the essence of the burial is the dead person. We're going to look into those universals in the particular context. So again, dialectic relationship between these universals of burial. They're always the same. We're always transitioning from one state to another. And but we look into that through to this particular context. And so through our Anthropologie de terrain or archaeothanatology, which was the Dudet and Claude Massé promoted in France, and disposition of taphonomy, the Anthropologie de terrain or archaeothanatology arose from a very different tradition than in the 60s than what happened with the processual analysis of burial ritual. And it took some 30 years to be formally published as a method, and then about another 15 to reach English-speaking audience. So it's kind of an important development in the field. So archaeothanatology focuses on the skeleton as a critical source of information. In terms of bioanthropology, we always focused on the population as the unit of analysis. Forensic anthropology, on the other hand, deals with the individual experience, but also, it has the hindsight, which we don't have. So one of the things that's really important is that when we recognize the population information, so when we are doing all these stats and stuff like that, we are obscuring individual experiences. So it is really important to concentrate on osteobiography, because this one describes the individual experience of a person as it was when it lived. So to the extent, of course, that we can do that. And then archaeothanatology tells us what burial rituals were associated with that person. So how we conceptualize burial. So first of all, burial is a disposal of a dead body. And it's also a prescribed ritual that allows this transition between different worlds. But it's also a series of gestures that enable us this transition from an individual to an ancestor, both for the dead. Okay, for that person which we are burying, the ritual helps them move from one state of being to another. For the living, so it helps the individual person deal with grief and loss and all sorts of emotions that are often associated, guilt, anything you can think of that is associated with someone who is close. In some way close to you die. And then for the community. And for the community, it's important because it actually reestablishes the broken network that is the breakage that's caused by the missing of a particular body. So this transition is very complex. It reflects the belief system. It reflects the social role of the deceased. It reflects the needs of descendants. It reflects those emotional needs to deal with the fact of dying, but also political needs. Sometimes an ancestor is an important political ally. If I can claim a particular ancestor, therefore I can be a part of a particular group, or maybe I can reclaim their social status. This transition can be then, because of this, manipulated for particular political goals. It can become appropriated, but it also has this effect of being cohesive. So it actually repairs the social fabric. So my main question when examining these things is, how do we in bioarchaeology gather understanding on any of these? Are there any general rules in the complex symbolism of burials? What evidence do we need to gather, and how do we interpret this evidence? So the evidence of burial activity is the best evidence of burial activity is looking at the dispositional taphonomy, or the way that the body and the surrounding represent themselves. So first of all, we can look at the initial deposition of the body, or what is commonly known as burial position. Then we can look in subsequent rearrangement of the skeletonized remains. And then we can look into resulting position of the individual at the excavation, which should not be actually equated with these things unless you have firm and clear evidence that that's the case. So it's not a recipe book, and that's a problem, right? So because what you're looking for is very individualized sequence of events that will actually depend on a lot of different ways in which the environment, the body, and the living interact within a particular burial. So in each case, you have to have to keep in mind that this is very individual sequence of events, that it cannot be, that you cannot have an assumption that it's always going to be the same. And that is always going to present as the same based on the fact that it interacts with the surrounding, right? So archaeotanatology relies on a very vast amount of meticulously collected data and anomalous positioning of bones. So basically, if there is something that you do not expect based on the actual position, then you have to explain it. And this explanation will often give you clues to the possible actual position of the burials. So this is basically something that you could look as chaîne opératoire of the ritual practice, where each step in the process will result in a different kind of positioning of these bodies. And so you get the meaning from the examination of this whole process of all these individual gestures, and from the normative in the burial group. So if you are examining a series of burials where people are buried individually, and then you're looking into some that are not buried as individuals but as a group, then you have to start to try to understand what does it mean, right? So our goal in mortuary archaeology is to look into whether we have population or populations. We're looking into interaction of these individuals within the population. And we're looking into change over time induced by changes in the environment, by migration, or by stochastic changes. So really, there is so many sources of variation in burial practice that it actually is not a straightforward interpretation of the burial record as you can. So what we're looking is trying to figure out the individual person, the dead, as much information about that person that we can get about the health status, sex, age, activity pattern, dietary preferences, all sorts of information that through bioanthropological and bioarchaeological or chemical methods we can come at. But then we also look into the corporate, we try to actually get to the corporate person, to the ancestor, because that corporate person, how that person is perceived by the descendant group and by the members of the society who remain, is reflected in how that person is buried. So we're going to try to get all of that information from individual person, from the corporate person, to the social group or economy, type of living structures, anything you can come up with in the archaeology that identifies them as the social group. And then we're going to look into what happens in changes over time when we compare these individual histories, their archaeological context, and what we can come up from all sorts of archaeological data to understand the group that we are looking at. So if you would like to read the actual paper or consult a more extensive bibliography, I have recently published this paper as part of as a prologue to the book by my colleagues from Cuba, who built a compendio de sitios arqueológicos aborígenes con presencia de restos humanos en Cuba. Thank you very much for listening.